and it's 8 on one side. As you can see, it discusses religion, religious holidays, clothes and gestures, ethnic groups, cultural customs, and cultural history. The information that's about, some of the information that's about a religion is very useful. For example, it discusses the 5 pillars of Islam, some of the religious holidays and dates. There is some useful information. The second page has some Arabic, including numbers, etc., and then things like don't do this and do this, and then how to understand Arabic names. Smart cards are a common sort of useful thing that appears in the military, just so you don't think that smart cards were only made for culture. And this, for example, is a basic combat training smart card. So this is a common way that material is produced for the military. Now, some of the more problematic ones, and this is where I begin with this one, is some of the material that's on this. Now, according to a civilian company that produces the smart card, as of 2006, over 1.8 million of the cards had been requested by this. Had been requested from this particular company. So this one, if you can't see it, here's a better one I will take. According to this, the white headdress, the man wearing a white headdress has not made the Hajj or pilgrimage to Mecca. A man wearing a black and white headdress is from a country with presidential rule, for example, Libya or Egypt, and has made the Hajj. And someone wearing the red checkered one is from a country with a monarch, for example, Saudi Arabia or Jordan, and has also made the Hajj. Now, just in case you think you didn't know this information all of your lives, this is really, really, really badly wrong. My next slide usually, I figured this was a fairly educated audience about the Middle East, so I didn't have my next slide, but next slide usually has a picture of King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia wearing a white headscarf, who obviously has made the Hajj every year of his life. The other point of this is not only is the information wrong, but what is the point of it? What are soldiers supposed to take away from this material as they learn, for example, if they see somebody in a black and white headscarf walking down the streets of Baghdad, are they supposed to think, oh, that person must be Libyan or Egypt, or that person must come from a country with presidential rule? So obviously this material is hugely problematic in terms of what the soldiers and Marines and others are supposed to get from it. But much of this early cultural training material used as frameworks for describing Iraqi culture, the national character studies that typified the culture research and cultural anthropology of the 1940s and 50s. Anthropologists long ago abandoned this way of seeing people and culture, as it did not adequately address cultural change or history, nor was it even ever seen as accurate. And if you're an anthropologist or remember World War II, some of the more famous ones were, for example, Ruth Benedict's book on Japan called The Chrysanthemum and the Sword. This was an example of that. And Raphael Patai's The Arab Mind is also an example of this sort of national character study. Now, the U.S. military's adoption of this national character studies conception of culture allows for an easy portrayal of what constitutes being Iraqi and Arab. In this paradigm, Iraqiness is timeless, bound by religion and family, and based in the inherent characteristics of a national group. It is never a product of a historical situation or political forces or governmental policies. These frameworks of national character, as in all Iraqis are this way or all Arabs do this, allow us to interpret Iraqi behavior, and here I'm paraphrasing James Scott, not as products of current contexts and, quote, the exercise of arbitrary power or of historical situations, but to the inherent characteristics of a national group. And the adoption of a conception of culture as national character points to 2 important assumptions. One, that servicemen and women can learn culture as a list of character traits and descriptions, and 2, that Iraqis actually behave and act in these ways. And the first is a pedagogical issue in terms of how you train people, and the second is one of accuracy. And as you can see, some of the accuracy issues are blatant, and others are more subtle. And I'm going to go through some of the more subtle ones. Early on in 2003, the Army 1st Infantry Division published a Soldier's Handbook to Iraq, which pledged to provide, quote, the basic information on Iraq's culture by offering you an overview of the country, its people, and their language, as well as their lifestyle and beliefs, end quote. So, while the U.S. administration sent Iraqis to the polls in January 2005 after much delay, the handbook had declared obliquely in a section called, quote, Arab worldview, that democracy would not work because the Arab worldview is one that contrasts wish with reality. Therefore, Iraqis' quote, desire for modernity is contradicted by a desire for tradition, especially Islamic tradition, since Islam is the one area free of Western identification and influence. Desiring democracy and modernization immediately is a good example of what a Westerner might view as an Arab's wish versus reality, end quote. So positing this mindset as fundamental of Iraqi culture is inaccurate. Wish versus reality could be applied to almost anyone, as we know. But it's also counterproductive to the U.S. mission, because with this statement, the handbook seems to undermine one of the stated reasons why the U.S. invaded Iraq in the first place, to overthrow Saddam Hussein and bring democratic rule to the country. Larger policies aside, this material is meant to be read and understood by average American soldiers. And so one of my questions is, what kind of message is the military communicating to American servicemen and women that it is asking to put their lives on the line for Iraq and Iraqis? That while Americans are freeing them from Saddam and bringing them democracy, which is sort of the narrative of the U.S. government, but the handbook is telling them that Iraqis are not fully developed enough to benefit from it. Such ambiguity cannot have been good for U.S. troop morale throughout the years in which this handbook was used. Now, the other issue that I find in this early cultural training material is related to this slide. And there I found that their cultural training material really also fed into the omnipresent image of a sectarian Iraq well before the sectarian fighting ever became sectarian, and well before there was even sectarian fighting. So you look at this panel. This was from the Smart Card, and it's a panel of cultural groups. It's called ethnic groups on other Smart Cards. And it seems to be sort of benign information, dividing up how Iraq is divided into these different groups of people in Iraq. But when you actually read it, I find it quite horrifying, and I would venture you will as well. So if a soldier read this material carefully, she would learn that, quote, Arabs view Kurds as separatists. I can look at it here. So you start at the top. Arabs view Kurds as separatists. Arabs view the Christian Assyrians as Iraqis, but recent Islamic extremism has sparked some hostility towards them. Arabs look down on Turkomen. Arabs view Iranian Persians negatively. Then you go to the next box. Tension exists between Sunni and Shia, Shia and Sunni Arabs. Sunnis blame Shia, Shia blame Sunnis. Go to the next one. Kurds are openly hostile towards Iraqi Arabs. Kurds are distrustful of the Turkomen. Kurds do not interact much with Assyrians and Chaldeans. Next one, Assyrians experience persecution by the Kurds and Arabs. Assyrians recognize their minority status, and they believe they have much in common with Chaldeans. Chaldeans rejoined the Catholic Church. They distrust both Kurdish and Arab intentions, and they have peaceful relations with the Turkomen. Turkomen view themselves as marginalized. They fear the Kurds, and they closely identify with Turkey and the Ottoman period. So the only positive relation in all of this is that Chaldeans have peaceful relationship with Turkomen, and that Assyrians have much in common with Chaldeans. So in contrast to the national character presentation of culture of one timeless Iraq, which I mentioned previously and which was in some of the other material, here this panel's vision of a nation in existence for more than 80 years presents the exact opposite, that there seem to be no Iraqis who are united by a sense of national interest, patriotism, or love of country. It seems instead that the ethnic and or religious tension trumps everything else. Put another way, soldiers are instructed that the national character of Iraq is hopelessly riven by primordial ethnic and sectarian hatreds. Such material, put in the hands of every single soldier and Marine serving in Iraq, all of whom patrol the country, dictate people's movements, and more, is not neutral information. This assertion, of course, does not excuse Iraqis for the violence that they have done and continue to do to each other. Rather, it is to suggest that the U.S. training material helped to crystallize divisions that might have remained inchoate otherwise. During the civil strife, the Smart Cards encouraged soldiers to view intercommunal violence as something inherent to Iraq and Arabs, or the Muslim world, and therefore beyond human control, rather than a struggle for power, money, and influence in the scrum of war, and the use of these political, religious, ethnic divisions to advance political or personal